So you think being a knight was all about galloping majestically into battle, saving maidens and looking glorious in shining armor? Right, like in those movies with sweeping orchestral scores and slow-motion sword fights? Yeah, no. Being a knight in the Middle Ages was less once and future king and more once I finish mucking out this stable. Maybe I can eat something that hasn't already been gnawed on by rats. It was basically signing up to be a violent, smelly, half-broken warhorse with a gambling problem. Let's take a walk through the rusty, blood-crusted reality of knighthood. And bring a sponge. You're gonna need it. Alright, first, forget your childhood. Because if you were lucky enough to be born into minor nobility, your childhood ended faster than a peasant's bread ration at a feast. At the ripe old age of 7, you were packed off to another noble house to begin your training. And by training, I don't mean sword fighting and horseback riding. No, first you were a page, which basically meant you were a tiny servant in tights. You cleaned armor, fetched wine, served dinner, and basically played squire to the squire. It was like being an unpaid medieval intern, except the HR department was a guy named Baldwin, who smelled like sheep and yelled a lot. But hey, at least you got to eat scraps off the plates, right? Assuming the other pages didn't get to them first. And after a few years of this glamorous lifestyle, you graduated to squire, which was just a fancy word for human pack mule. You carried a knight's weapons, dressed him in armor. That 60 pounds of metal wasn't going to put itself on, you know. Held his horse, and probably got hit in the face with a helmet more times than you'd like to admit. Now, if you were really lucky, and I mean really lucky, your knight didn't die of dysentery in a ditch, or get skewered by a random peasant with a pitchfork during your squireship. If you survived long enough, and your knight thought you were almost as good as his warhorse at not running away from a fight, you might one day be knighted. This usually involved a lot of religious ceremony, some awkward kneeling while a dude in a pointy hat whacked you with a sword, and maybe a feast if your lord was feeling generous. Oh, and you probably had to prove you could bash someone's head in while not falling off a horse, because nothing says chivalry like a good old-fashioned concussion. Speaking of chivalry, let's talk about the code of chivalry, shall we? You know, that romanticized idea that knights were all brave, loyal, and pure-hearted defenders of the weak. The one that's been romanticized in stories and poems for centuries. Yeah, that was about as real as a unicorn riding a dragon while juggling flaming swords. According to the legends, knights were practically saints in shining armor. According to reality, they were more like heavily armed landlords who spent most of their time collecting rent, getting into bar fights, or burning someone else's village over a border dispute. Protecting the weak? Sure, unless you were a peasant, woman, heretic, or from a rival lord's estate. Then you were basically target practice. And loyalty? Knights switch sides more often than I switch between existential dread and wondering what's for dinner. Whoever paid more, or offered a better castle, usually got the pointy end of the sword. Look, the code of chivalry was a great idea in theory. It was basically a medieval marketing campaign designed to make knights look less like heavily armed thugs and more like, well, noble knights. And it worked surprisingly well considering we're still talking about it today. But in practice, it was about as common as a vegetarian butcher. Now let's talk fashion. Yes, the armor looked cool. All gleaming metal and intricate designs. It's practically medieval bling. But have you ever worn 60 pounds of metal in the middle of summer with no ventilation and zero deodorant? Yeah, me neither. But I can tell you, it wasn't pretty. Imagine this. You're basically encased in a giant metal oven. The sun is beating down on you, your sweat is turning into a lovely primordial soup inside your armor, and you can barely move, let alone fight. Knights in full armor could roast like a chicken inside a smithy. In fact, they often passed out from heatstroke before they even saw the enemy. And no, they didn't always get help to mount their horse. Imagine a bunch of guys in full plate armor trying to gracefully swing a leg over a horse. They just kind of flopped and scrambled like armored frogs until someone took pity on them. And let's not forget the bathroom situation, or lack thereof. You didn't. You held it or you did it in the suit and hoped for rain. So next time you see a movie knight riding confidently across a field, just remember he's probably sitting in his own medieval soup, praying his horse doesn't decide to roll in the mud. Speaking of not-so-pleasant experiences, let's talk about battle. Because if you thought it was anything like those choreographed dances you see in movies, you're about as wrong as a peasant who thought he could win an argument with a tax collector. Battle wasn't elegant. It wasn't a display of skill and valor. It was mud, blood, a whole lot of screaming. and the distinct aroma of fear and whatever unholy concoction they called food back then. Knights fought with swords, lances, and maces, not to show off their fancy footwork, but to crush your skull before you crushed theirs. It was basically medieval MMA with less rules and a lot more tetanus. And jousting, that wasn't a sport. It was two armored lunatics charging at each other with sharpened poles on horseback, fueled by too much mead, and the faint hope of impressing some noblewoman who probably wouldn't have looked twice at them if they weren't wearing the family fortune in plate armor. Great fun, until someone lost an eye, or a jaw, or their actual head. And here's the kicker. Armor didn't make you invincible. In fact, it could be a death sentence if you fell off your horse and couldn't get up, which, let's be honest, happened more often than you'd think. You might get trampled by your own side, and if you were captured, you'd be held for ransom. Unless you were poor, then you'd just be killed and looted. Priorities, people. So, what did knights do when they weren't busy trying to turn each other into human shish kebabs? Well, when they weren't recovering from dysentery, infected wounds, or the occasional arrow to the knee, they were basically glorified landlords. Between battles, knights spent their time managing land, arguing with priests about taxes, drinking too much wine, and occasionally trying not to die from some plague that was making the rounds. Oh, and gout, the disease of champions. Because a diet of meat, wine, and bad hygiene does wonders for your joints. They also trained, sort of. By which I mean they got drunk and practiced hitting things with sticks. Hey, it was better than hitting each other with real swords, right? And when they weren't doing that, they were off joining crusades, burning cities, or trying to marry into more land. Because why die poor when you can die rich and in plate armor? Now for the grand finale, retirement. Just kidding, there was no retirement plan for knights, no 401k or comfy pension. Eventually, every knight got too old, too injured, or too broke to keep swinging a sword. If you were lucky, and by this point you should know that lucky is a relative term when talking about medieval knights, you retired to a stone manor with bad plumbing and even worse food. There, you regaled anyone who'd listen with exaggerated tales of your glory days, conveniently leaving out the part where you mostly just fell off horses and lost your lunch thanks to some poorly cooked mutton. If you weren't lucky, well, you could try joining a monastery. They were always happy to take in old, broken-down warriors who could swing a donation plate harder than a broadsword. Or, and this was a real treat, you could become a mercenary for hire, working for whoever could afford your increasingly chipped and dented self. And let's be real. Most knights didn't die gloriously on the battlefield, clutching a blood-stained locket and whispering the name of their true love. They died of infected wounds, drunk horseback accidents, or from mysterious causes in some court intrigue that probably involved a jealous husband, a poisoned goblet, and a very unfortunate tapestry. Outro. So, no. Being a knight wasn't all shiny armor and noble quests. It was sweat, rot, violence, political bootlicking, and armor that gave you back problems by age 30. Romantic? Not unless your idea of romance involves lice, violence, and the smell of boiled leather. But hey, at least they had cool helmets.